Welcome to Land of Horror. Today, we will continue our journey to explore the most chilling mysteries. Do you have the courage to face spooky stories, terrifying legends, and unexplained supernatural phenomena? Join me as we delve into haunted places, dark secrets, and legendary figures that will send shivers down your spine. Before we begin, make sure to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss any videos, and let's step into the world of Land of Horror together. Get ready, because thrilling moments await you. Are you ready to explore? The moon hung low in the sky, casting a faint silver glow over the quiet streets of the affluent Chicago neighborhood. Jake Patterson's heart beat steadily in his chest as he crouched behind the high, wrought iron fence that enclosed the mansion's sprawling grounds. His breath was shallow, controlled, as his eyes traced the darkened windows of the house. Next to him, Liam Carter's lips curled into a grin, his eyes bright with excitement. "Ready?" Liam whispered, his voice low but charged with an energy that made Jake's skin prickle. Jake nodded, feeling a pit in his stomach, but he couldn't show hesitation. Not now. Liam thrived on these moments, and any sign of doubt would be seen as weakness. Jake swallowed his unease, slipping the small lock-picking kit from his jacket pocket. The mansion loomed before them, its grand architecture and opulence stark against the stillness of the night. To Jake, it was just another symbol of the world that didn't care about people like him and Liam. Smart, capable, but ultimately insignificant in the grand scheme of things. For Liam, it was a challenge, a chance to break the rules and take something from the world that had denied him excitement. The lock clicked open, and the gate creaked slightly as they pushed it ajar. They slipped inside the grounds, their footsteps silent against the cobblestone path leading to the back of the house. "Keep your cool," Liam whispered, his eyes scanning the perimeter. "We're ghosts tonight." Jake nodded, wiping his damp palms on his pants. He hated this feeling, the adrenaline surging through him, mixed with fear, excitement, and dread. Every time they did this, it felt like they were inching closer to something inevitable, something dark. As they reached the rear of the house, Liam pulled out a small device, a jammer Jake had rigged up to temporarily disable the home's security system. With a flick of a switch, the red light on the control panel blinked off. "All set," Liam whispered, a wicked smile stretching across his face. "Let's make it quick." Inside, the house was eerily quiet. The air was thick with the scent of expensive furniture, polished wood, and cold marble. The grand staircase twisted upward like a snake, disappearing into the shadows of the second floor. Jake felt the weight of the place pressing down on him, every creak of the floorboards amplifying his anxiety. They moved quickly, their practiced hands lifting small valuables, watches, jewelry, cash, from drawers and cabinets. It was never about the money for Liam. It was about the thrill of the game. For Jake, though, the excitement was fading, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. "Let's leave a little message," Liam muttered, pulling a black marker from his pocket. He scrawled a crude drawing on the back of a framed family photo, leaving it on the bed as a taunt. "Just to let them know we were here." Jake looked at the photo. A family of four smiling on a beach vacation. Something twisted in his gut. They were disrupting people's lives, people who had done nothing to them. But Liam didn't care. To him, these people were faceless, part of the system he despised. As they slipped out of the house, the first hints of dawn began to bleed into the sky. They were long gone by the time the family would wake, unaware of the violation that had occurred in the dead of night. The next heist was more ambitious. Jake and Liam stood outside the small luxury store, hidden in the shadows of a nearby alley. The store was closed for the night, its sleek glass facade glinting under the dim streetlights. "You've got the security system, right?" Liam asked, adjusting his leather gloves. Jake nodded, though his stomach churned. "I've got it." But we need to be fast. If the alarm triggers, we'll only have a few minutes before. We'll be fine. Liam cut him off, his voice brimming with confidence. Let's do this. They moved in silence, Jake using a small laptop to bypass the store's security system. The lights flickered inside, the cameras momentarily disabled as the door clicked open. They slipped inside, their footsteps muted against the polished floors. Liam went straight for the display cases, his fingers dancing over the expensive watches and jewelry inside. Jake worked faster this time, his hands steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. But something felt off, an unease that settled deep in his bones. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from the back room. Jake's heart leapt into his throat as a security guard emerged, his flashlight sweeping across the store. Liam didn't hesitate. In one fluid motion, he lunged at the guard, slamming him against the wall. The guard's head hit the glass with a sickening crack, and he slumped to the floor, unconscious. Come on! Liam hissed, grabbing Jake by the arm and pulling him toward the exit. They sprinted into the night, disappearing into the maze of alleyways. Jake's breath came in ragged gasps, his mind racing. They had crossed a line, one they couldn't come back from. The clock on the dashboard glowed 7:46 p.m. as the van rolled down the narrow street. The fading daylight cast long shadows over the quiet suburban neighborhood. Jake Patterson sat in the passenger seat, his hands gripping the edge of his seat until his knuckles turned white. Samuel Wallace was walking down the sidewalk just a block ahead, oblivious to the van slowly creeping up behind him. He wore a soccer jersey, his backpack slung over one shoulder. And he moved with the carefree ease of a boy who believed the world was safe. Liam Carter's voice cut through the silence. This is it, Jake. No turning back now. Jake nodded, though the knot in his stomach tightened. They had spent weeks watching Samuel, learning his routine. Soccer practice 3 times a week, always walking home alone after his parents' work kept him busy. The perfect target, Liam had said. But now, as they approached the moment of truth, Jake's mind was racing with doubts. Liam pulled the van to the curb, its engine humming softly. He turned to Jake, his eyes glinting with that familiar thrill. Let's go! They slipped out of the van, moving quickly and silently. Liam grabbed a cloth soaked in chloroform, while Jake hung back, his heart pounding in his chest. Samuel was only a few feet away now, still unaware of their presence. Liam struck fast, wrapping the cloth over Samuel's mouth and nose, pulling him into the shadows between 2 houses. The boy struggled, his eyes wide with terror, but his strength faded quickly as the chemical took effect. In seconds, Samuel was unconscious. Get the van door, Liam whispered, his voice urgent but steady. Jake's hands trembled as he yanked open the back door, and Liam shoved Samuel's limp body inside. The smell of chloroform lingered in the air as they slammed the door shut and sped off into the night. The hideout was a dilapidated old building on the outskirts of the city, long abandoned and forgotten by time. It stood on the edge of a forest, far enough from any prying eyes to be considered safe for their purposes. As they pulled up to the hideout, the van's tires crunching over gravel, Jake felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The boy in the back seat was still unconscious, his face pale in the dim light. Liam cut the engine and turned to Jake. Grab his feet. Let's move him inside. Jake hesitated, staring at Samuel's motionless form. What are we doing, Liam? This is too far. Liam shot him a dark look. Don't get soft on me now, Jake. We planned this. We execute it. Simple. The word stung, but Jake swallowed his protests. He had made his choice. Now, there was no going back. Together, they lifted Samuel's body and carried him into the building, laying him down on a dusty mattress in the basement. The room was cold, the air damp with the scent of mildew. The walls seemed to close in around them, and Jake's skin crawled with unease.
He'll wake up soon,
Liam said, checking his watch.
We need to send the ransom note tonight.
Jake nodded absently, his mind elsewhere. As Liam began drafting the ransom letter, Jake stared at Samuel, who was beginning to stir, a faint groan escaping his lips. The boy looked fragile, vulnerable, nothing like the cold, calculated plan they had discussed.
I'll handle the drop,
Liam said.
You stay here. Keep an eye on him.
The thought of being alone with Samuel, of hearing his pleas and cries when he awoke, filled Jake with dread. But he couldn't argue. Liam was the leader. Liam made the decisions. By the time Liam returned from mailing the ransom note, Samuel was awake. The boy sat in the corner of the room, his knees drawn to his chest, his eyes red and puffy from crying. Jake had tried to comfort him, offering food and water, but Samuel had refused, too scared to speak. The silence between them was suffocating. Liam strode into the room, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction.
It's done. Now we wait for his daddy to cough up the cash.
Samuel flinched at the sound of Liam's voice, his small body trembling. Jake felt a pang of guilt, stronger than before. This wasn't a game anymore. This was real. Too real.
We should let him go after the ransom,
Jake said, his voice low.
We don't need to hurt him.
Liam's smile faded.
Let him go. Are you kidding me, Jake? He's seen our faces. He knows who we are. We can't take that risk.
Jake's stomach churned. He hadn't thought of that. He had convinced himself that once they got the money, they could walk away, no harm done. But now, hearing Liam's cold logic, the reality hit him like a freight train. They were in too deep. Liam walked over to Samuel, crouching down so their faces were level.
Don't worry, kid,
he said, his voice soft but menacing.
As long as your daddy pays up, you'll be just fine.
Samuel didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the floor, silent tears rolling down his cheeks. The bracelet lay in an evidence bag on the detective's desk, the thin silver chain glinting under the harsh office lights. Detective Sarah Green stared at it for what felt like the 100th time that day, her mind racing through the possibilities.
Any luck with tracing it?
Her partner, Detective Tom Rivers, asked as he leaned back in his chair, sipping his cold coffee.
Yeah,
Sarah said, tapping her fingers against the desk.
It's custom made. Sold by a boutique jeweler downtown. We're pulling the sales records now.
Rivers whistled low.
So we've got a potential link to the kidnapper?
Sarah nodded, feeling the familiar surge of excitement that came with a break in the case. After weeks of dead ends and false leads, they finally had something solid. The media had been relentless since the abduction, plastering Samuel Wallace's face across every news outlet. The pressure was on to find the boy before it was too late.
Let's hope this gives us what we need,
she muttered, turning her attention back to the bracelet. Across town, Jake Patterson was sitting in the dark, staring at his reflection in the mirror. His face was pale, his eyes hollow from lack of sleep. The events of the past few weeks had taken their toll, and the weight of it all was beginning to crush him. Next to him, Liam paced the room, his expression tense.
You need to pull yourself together, Jake,
he snapped, his voice harsh.
The police are closing in. We can't afford to slip up now.
Jake didn't respond. He could still see Samuel's face in his mind, the fear in the boy's eyes, the way his body had gone limp in Liam's arms. It haunted him, every second of every day.
We stick to the plan,
Liam continued, oblivious to Jake's internal turmoil.
We wait for the ransom, and then we disappear. Simple.
But it wasn't simple anymore. Nothing was simple. Jake's hands trembled as he ran them through his hair, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like a vice. He didn't know how much longer he could take this. The following day, Sarah Green stepped into the boutique jewelry store, a determined look on her face. The store manager, an older woman with sharp eyes, greeted her at the counter.
Good afternoon, Detective. I have the sales records you requested.
Sarah nodded, her pulse quickening. This could be it. This could be the break they needed to finally track down Samuel's abductors. The manager handed her a stack of paperwork, and Sarah began flipping through it, scanning each page carefully. And then she saw it. The name Patterson. Her heart skipped a beat. The bracelet had been purchased by a Margaret Patterson, likely a family member of Jake Patterson, who fit the profile of someone involved in the kidnapping. Sarah quickly made a note of the address attached to the sale, and thanked the manager before heading back to her car. As she drove back to the station, her mind raced. If Patterson was involved in this, it wouldn't be long before they had enough evidence to make an arrest. She could already picture the headlines. Kidnapper identified, police closing in. Back in the apartment, Jake felt a shiver run down his spine. He had been on edge all day, sensing that something was coming, something he couldn't control. And he was right. Liam's paranoia was getting worse. He hardly slept, constantly checking the windows and pacing the small apartment. Every sound from the street made him flinch, his hand twitching toward the gun he kept tucked in his waistband.
We need to get out of here,
Liam muttered, his eyes darting around the room.
They're getting closer. I can feel it.
Jake said nothing. He sat at the kitchen table, his mind numb. He couldn't think, couldn't process what was happening anymore. It was all too much.
We should have gotten rid of that bracelet,
Liam hissed, glaring at Jake.
It's your fault that they traced it back to us.
Jake flinched at the accusation, guilt gnawing at his insides. He knew Liam was right. The bracelet had been a stupid mistake, one that could cost them everything. But it was too late now. There was no going back. As the tension between them grew, Jake realized something terrifying. Liam was becoming increasingly unstable. And if he didn't do something soon, things were going to get a lot worse. The cold air stung Jake's face as he stepped off the bus into the tiny, desolate town. His clothes were ragged, his face unshaven, and his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. It had been weeks since he'd left the city, weeks since he'd abandoned everything he knew. Liam's death replayed in his mind constantly. The look in his eyes as he fell to the floor, the sound of his skull cracking against the concrete. It haunted Jake in every quiet moment. But he couldn't afford to think about that now. He had to stay ahead of the police, stay hidden. Jake pulled his hood up, glancing around the empty streets. This place, far from the bustling city, was his sanctuary for the time being. No one here knew who he was or what he had done. At least not yet. But the nightmares followed him everywhere. At night, he would wake up in a cold sweat, hearing Liam's voice, Samuel's voice, echoing in his head. The hallucinations had grown worse, more vivid. He saw their faces in every shadow, heard their whispers in every gust of wind. As Jake walked down the road toward a rundown motel, his mind raced. He couldn't stay here forever. He needed a plan, a way out. But with each passing day, the weight of his guilt pressed down on him, making it harder and harder to think clearly. Detective Sarah Green stood in the middle of the warehouse where Liam's body had been found. The scene was grisly, bloodstains on the floor, signs of a struggle. But there was no sign of Jake. He had vanished without a trace. Sarah's jaw tightened as she surveyed the area. The discovery of Liam's body had confirmed her suspicions that Jake was more involved in the Wallace case than they had originally thought. Now, it was just a matter of finding him before he disappeared for good.
We've traced his last known whereabouts to a bus station downtown,
her partner, Tom Rivers, said, approaching with a stack of files.
He could be anywhere by now.
Sarah nodded, frustration gnawing at her. Every lead they had on Jake had gone cold, and the pressure from above was mounting. Samuel Wallace's parents were demanding answers, and the media had latched onto the story like vultures, circling every development.
I don't care how
long it takes.
Sarah muttered, her voice low and determined.
We're going to find him.
Megan sat at her kitchen table, staring at the phone in front of her. Jake's voice still echoed in her mind from their last conversation, a desperate, broken plea for help. He had sounded different, almost unrecognizable, like a man on the edge of losing everything. She had known Jake for years. They'd grown up together, gone to the same high school, shared the same group of friends. But the person Jake had become was a stranger. She knew deep down that whatever he was involved in was dangerous. And now he had asked for her help. Megan chewed her lip, glancing at the door. The thought of betraying Jake, of turning him in to the police, made her stomach churn. But she couldn't ignore the fear that gripped her every time she thought about what he had done. Suddenly, her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. It was Jake. Again. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, her voice barely a whisper.
Hello? Megan, I need you. Please.
The desperation in his voice made her heart pound. She closed her eyes, struggling with the decision she had to make. The line between right and wrong had never felt so blurred. The cell was small, suffocating, but Jake barely noticed anymore. The wall seemed to close in on him every day, pressing down like the weight of his crimes. His reflection in the small, cracked mirror above the sink was a stranger's, a gaunt face with hollow eyes, skin pale from the lack of sunlight. His mind was slipping, he could feel it. The whispers were louder now, no longer just at night but throughout the day, creeping into every thought. Samuel's voice, Liam's laughter, they were always there, reminding him of what he had done. Jake sat on the edge of the cot, head in his hands. He could hear the footsteps of the guards outside, the clinking of keys, the distant murmur of prisoners talking in the yard. But all of it felt far away, like he was drifting, lost in a fog of guilt and fear. He hadn't spoken to anyone in days, not since the last visitor, a psychologist sent by his attorney to evaluate his mental state. He had refused to talk to her, refusing to let anyone inside his head. He couldn't afford to let anyone see the chaos swirling inside. The door to his cell clanged open, and a guard stepped in.
You've got a visitor,
the guard said gruffly. Jake didn't move. He didn't care. What was the point? The trial was already set, the evidence stacked against him. There was no escape.
Get up,
the guard barked, stepping closer.
You're going to see your lawyer.
Reluctantly, Jake stood, his body aching from days of inactivity. He followed the guard down the long corridor, the fluorescent lights overhead casting harsh shadows on the concrete walls. Every step felt heavier than the last, his legs dragging like they were weighed down by invisible chains. As they reached the visitor's room, Jake's heart began to race. He didn't want to see anyone. He didn't want to face the outside world, not after what he had done. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Reporters lined the back of the room, their cameras flashing as Jake was led to the defendant's table. The whispers of the crowd echoed in his ears, blending with the voices in his head. At the front of the room, the prosecutor stood, her eyes locked on Jake. She was confident, poised, ready to deliver the final blow that would seal his fate. Her opening statement had been brutal, painting Jake as a cold-blooded killer with no remorse. But Jake's defense attorney wasn't backing down. He had spent hours preparing for this moment, crafting a narrative that would challenge the prosecution's case. His argument was simple. Jake wasn't in control of his actions. His mind was fractured, broken by trauma, and he couldn't be held fully accountable. Megan sat in the witness stand, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. She recounted her history with Jake, their childhood friendship, and how he had changed in recent years. Her voice wavered when she described the last time she had seen him, the desperation in his eyes, the fear in his voice.
I didn't recognize him anymore,
she said quietly, her gaze dropping to the floor.
He wasn't the person I used to know.
The prosecutor seized on this, using Megan's testimony to paint a picture of Jake's descent into madness. But the defense attorney pushed back, arguing that Jake's mental state was the key to understanding his actions. As the trial wore on, Jake remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor. The courtroom drama played out around him, but he felt disconnected from it all, as if he were watching from a distance. When the jury finally returned, the room fell silent. Every eye was on Jake as the foreman stood, holding the piece of paper that would decide his fate.
We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts.
The words echoed in the courtroom, rippling through the packed audience like a shockwave. Jake felt a strange detachment, as though the verdict was not his, but someone else's. The room, filled with murmurs of satisfaction and whispered opinions, felt distant, almost unreal. His eyes remained fixed on the floor, his mind numb, unable to fully comprehend the weight of the words that had sealed his fate. The judge's voice cut through the haze.
Nathaniel Jake Morris, you are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. May justice be served, and may you find the strength to reckon with the consequences of your actions.
There was no emotion on Jake's face, no outburst, no reaction. Inside, his mind was a storm of fragmented thoughts, memories of the crime, of Samuel's twisted influence, and of his own descent into darkness. But outwardly, he was hollow, a shell of the person he once was. The sound of the gavel slamming down marked the end. The courtroom erupted with voices, but Jake could hear none of it. The guards moved to escort him away, their firm grip on his arms guiding him back into the darkness that awaited him. As he was led out, his eyes flickered briefly toward Megan, who sat rigid in her seat, her face pale but resolute. For a moment, their gazes met. There was no forgiveness in her eyes, only a quiet sadness, the kind that came with knowing you'd never truly escape the past. Jake blinked, and the connection was broken. She turned away, and so did he. Back in his cell, the silence was deafening. No more courtroom drama, no more lawyers or arguments. Just the steady hum of prison life, punctuated by the occasional shout or clang of metal doors. Jake lay on his cot, staring up at the ceiling, the weight of the sentence finally pressing down on him. Life without parole. He would die in this place. His mind began to drift, back to the early days with Samuel, the thrill of their first crime, the intoxicating rush of power. But now, those memories felt twisted, corrupted by the horror that followed. The faces of his victims haunted him, their eyes wide with terror, their pleas for mercy ringing in his ears. He closed his eyes, but the images only grew stronger. For weeks, Jake spiraled deeper into his own mind, plagued by nightmares and hallucinations. He saw Samuel in the shadows, heard Liam's laughter in the empty corridors. The weight of guilt crushed him, yet he was too far gone to find any sense of redemption. Detective Sarah Green stood by the courthouse steps, watching the crowd disperse after the verdict. She had caught the man she'd been hunting for so long, yet there was no satisfaction, no relief. Just exhaustion. The price she had paid to bring Jake to justice was higher than she ever imagined. Her relationships had suffered. She had grown distant from her family, from her colleagues. Even now, as the public hailed her as a hero, she felt the cost of obsession, the sleepless nights, the missed moments, the lingering guilt over the lines she had crossed to catch him. But it was over now, she told herself. It was finally over. As she turned to leave, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from her daughter.
Come home. We miss you.
For the first time in months, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Maybe now, With Jake locked away, she could start to rebuild what she had lost. She took a deep breath and began walking, her steps lighter than they had been in years. Megan stood on the train platform, a suitcase by her side, waiting for the train that would take her away from the city that had been the backdrop to so much pain. She had decided to leave, to start over somewhere far from the memories of Jake, of Samuel, of everything that had happened. It was the only way she could heal. The train arrived, and she boarded, taking a seat by the window. As the city skyline began to fade into the distance, Megan closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. The weight of the past still clung to her, but with each passing mile, it grew lighter. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of peace. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from a friend in her new city.
Can't wait to see you. I have so much to show you when you arrive.
Megan smiled, the faintest trace of optimism lighting her features. She knew the scars of the past wouldn't disappear overnight, but she was ready to face whatever came next. And this time, she would do it on her own terms. Back in his cell, Jake lay motionless, his breathing shallow. His mind was a fractured maze of memories and nightmares, each turned darker than the last. The faces of those he had wronged, Liam, the boys, even Samuel, swarmed him, their eyes full of accusation. But in the end, it was not the ghost that would finish him. It was the silence, the absence of everything, the thrill, the power, the games, left only a void, and Jake could no longer bear its weight. One night, the guards found him, still and cold on his cot, a small piece of cloth tied tightly around his neck. The final act of a man who had been running from himself for too long. His death was reported in the morning news, but it barely made a ripple. The world had moved on. In the end, the story was not just about the crimes committed or the justice served. It was about the people left behind, the lives changed, and the reckoning that came for everyone, not just Jake. For Megan, for Detective Green, and even for those in the shadows of his life, the echoes of what had happened would always linger, but the world would continue to turn, and they would all have to find a way forward. Jake's story ended in silence, but for those who survived him, life, imperfect and scarred, carried on.